Well, good morning. My name's Bryce. I'm the lead pastor here, and we are starting a series today, and a two-part series, kind of a mini-series or a two-part message on depression. And one of the things that happened to me this week is one of the things I try to do as I go out into the community is to share love with people, right? To love on people, and especially when you come in contact with them at the store or the restaurant or whatever it is. So I met a guy at a store this week, and one of the things I like to ask people, especially when they give me great service, I'm like, I'll ask this question, what is the source of your joy? And so this guy was so kind to me, like he didn't make me go through the line that goes like this. He's like, hey, just come on over to the register. And he was talking to me about my purchase and how it was a great purchase and all these things. And so he was doing a great job. And I only say it, right, when I can say it sincerely, because sometimes, we all know, it's not the case, right? But this guy in particular was just doing a great job. And so I asked him, I said, hey, what's the source of your joy? Like, how do you come to work and just do what you do with such happiness? Because I just want you to know, like, I've been blessed by how you've interacted with me today. And it caused him to tear up. And he said, actually, I've lost just about everything. And I have to make the decision every day to come to work and to choose joy. To choose to be joyful. And most of the time when I ask this question, it's a very lighthearted conversation. I did not expect this response at all. And so we continue the interaction, and I'm like, well, I'm so trying to empathize with him. I'm so sorry to hear that. And I think he was somewhat annoyed, maybe not annoyed, but somewhat kind of taken back that I asked such a deep question. And so I just took out one of these cards and invited him, to church. I said, hey, look, I'd love for you to come worship. I'm the lead pastor of the church right around the corner. I'd love for you to come worship with us this Sunday. And so I just want to encourage you guys. Like, we have these little baggies in the seat back in front of you, and just I think in light of this series, and we find this out because we have 2 consignment stores that we own and operate, and one's right here in Woodstock, and we have prayer requests that people put. Prayer requests on these cards and drop it in a box. And it's astounding to me the kinds of things that people are walking through in their lives. And how there are people out there in the community that need to find God, right? That need to come into a relationship with Jesus. And so I just want to encourage, if there's any application from today's message, that we take the call seriously. To be called into the community and to invite people into the family of God and to share a witness about what Jesus has done in our lives, that we would be kind of ready to do that as we go from here. But as I was saying today, that's what we are going to talk about today, is this aspect of depression. And I think it's more widespread than perhaps we realize, and it's based on a book written by the same title, written by Chris Hodges. He leads the Church of the Highlands in Birmingham, Alabama, and he writes the book on the back end of several instances of his personal struggles with depression. And I'm going to do the best I can today to kind of sum up what he has to say, kind of leaning on his research and his experience. And I don't know that I've technically experienced what would be classified as depression, but I do know I have several close family members and friends who've experienced and have been diagnosed with clinical depression. And as a result, I myself went on anxiety medication as a teenager. It was a very short period of time. It was like less than a month, but it was to that point where I was feeling this sense of anxiety because of the depression I was experiencing around me. And I've also been in close proximity to the coping mechanisms that we often use to deal with depression. Because oftentimes we try to medicate, right? Self-medicate depression and try to get it away from us. So I've been in those kind of programs and been around those kind of things that help people get free. And for me, like, the 2 main tragedies in my life that have caused me to struggle with intense sadness at the very least, and maybe get a glimpse of what depression looks like, is my wife and I's ongoing struggle with unexplained infertility, and then our first daughter's diagnosis with type 1 diabetes, which, if you've been here often, you hear me talk about these things often. And one thing about me is I hate to feel sad. Like, I can't stand it. I'm a very positive person by nature, and I think I'm naturally naive. But I'm naive as kind of like a coping mechanism. Like if all the evidence is pointing that something's bad, I'm just going to pick the few good things and believe those, right? To not focus on that. And so that doesn't help me at times. It doesn't help me to empathize with somebody who's perhaps going through something and they're saying, man, this is so terrible because of this, this, and this. And I just immediately say, no, but think about this, this, and this, right? Like it's all good. So I have to realize that I'm not helpful in that way. And it doesn't help me either, right? It didn't help me when I was struggling. As my daughter got diagnosed in November of 2021, I vividly remember the night and days that followed that just completely turned our world upside down. Like we had, it was beginning of November, so I remember vividly that Thanksgiving day. Like normally one of my favorite days just being one of the worst days. And we had family and friends over, and we were trying to act normal as we coped with kind of this new diagnosis of type 1 diabetes, and it was just feeling so heavy and so dark. We felt overwhelmed, shocked, angry, sad, like this extremely heavy burden had been hung around our previously kind of reasonably happy lives. Like all of a sudden we had this weight that we were carrying. And the story of battling with unexplained infertility and then receiving this call from God to say, okay, let's step into adoption. And then realizing that this little girl that we adopted now has a lifelong illness. And I'm like, it's one of those times where when you're talking to God, you're just like, what is going on, right? Like, why? What is happening? And you just feel this sense of like, this sense of frustration. And it's really, I think, the only time in my life where I've probably or maybe experienced a short stint of depression. And we were in the middle of processing this pain, and it was really, really hard to kind of see the light at the end of the tunnel. Like we knew it was there, and like we knew the promises of God, but it was just hard. You just feel so deep in this sense of sadness that you can't really grab a hold of anything, and you just feel like you're falling further and further back. And I'd say, regardless if you've experienced depression or not, all of us have experienced kind of this worldwide trauma, right? The global pandemic. We've all gone through that together. And I think about my youngest daughter, who's now 6 months old. Like she will be like one of the first people who didn't go through that. And I wonder what that will look like in years forward as we reflect. Like it's like the people who did experience 9/11 and then people that weren't alive then. Like we talk about those in two different categories. I feel like this will be that kind of thing as well. But these are some stats in 2020. So the mental health hotline went up 900% in 2020. The CDC reported that 1/4 of young people under the age of 30 considered suicide in 2020. And then 1/10 of the rest of us. Divorce filings were up 20%. Antidepressant medication up 300%. And so depression and battles with mental health have become an epidemic of their own in the U.S. And I do believe that a relationship with Jesus, actually I know it to be true, is a big remedy for this epidemic that's happening here in the U.S. And I believe that. I believe the church has a role to play in seeing people set free. But I do want to make two qualifying statements as I talk about this particular subject. Number one, I do recognize that there are real biological and genetic reasons why someone would struggle with depression. Things that are not circumstantial, but they're biological, right? They're genetic, perhaps. And then number two, there can be a real stigma when it comes to kind of mental health, especially in the church. But I just want to say this, I take Zyrtec during allergy season because there's something in my body that malfunctions and reacts negatively to the pollen in the air during springtime. And I don't know what happens in the fall. There's something happening in the fall too, where oftentimes I have to take Zyrtec. But none of you would think that I lack faith because I take Zyrtec. None of you would think less of me for taking Zyrtec because a part of my body is working at less than peak efficiency. Well, the mind is a part of the body too and can be in the same condition, right? You don't think less of me when I take Zyrtec, so we shouldn't think less of people who are struggling with their minds. And regardless of what we struggle with, our illness is not our identity, regardless of what we struggle with. And I know that whether it's a perspective change in life that's needed, miraculous physical healing that needs to take place, or even the grace of modern medication that's needed to help us get free, I know one thing for certain, that the pathway to lasting freedom starts with a relationship with God through Jesus. That's why the first aspect of our vision statement, before you can get to the freedom part, you got to come to know God. You got to know what He says about you. You got to know what Jesus has done for you. And remember those things as you walk through this life and encounter those curveballs that come our way. The inevitable things that we all have to walk through. The sense of pain and loss. Galatians 5:1 says, "For freedom, Christ has set us free." And we're going to explore this pathway to freedom today through the prophet Elijah. So we're going to talk about Elijah. But I want to point out a couple of other characters in the Bible that seem to struggle with some form of depression as well. And so if maybe just listen to these passages and see if you've ever been in the cave or have struggled with depression, maybe you can identify with what some of these biblical characters are saying. So Lamentations 3, verses 17 through 20. Verse 17, "My soul is bereft of peace." Bereft? Really? Why? Why do we use bereft? He didn't have peace. That's what it means. My soul is bereft of peace. I have forgotten what happiness is. Think of the felt experience of that. I have forgotten what happiness is. I can't even remember what it feels like to be happy. So I say, my endurance has perished. So has my hope from the Lord. Remember my affliction and my wanderings, the wormwood and the gall, which is just referring to like the bitterness of what I'm experiencing. My soul continually remembers it and is bowed down within me. So that's the prophet Jeremiah, right, who wrote words in the Bible, right, and is experiencing this felt sense of depression. How about the Apostle Paul? 2 Corinthians 1:8. "For we do not want you to be unaware, brothers, of the affliction we experienced in Asia, for we were so utterly burdened beyond our strength that we despaired of life itself." Does anybody identify, or maybe have identified, with either Paul or Elijah? But what I want to talk about today is the prophet Elijah. And we've talked about Paul, we've talked about Jeremiah. And he's easily actually argued as the greatest prophet in the Bible. And we know this because when Jesus took a couple of his disciples up on the Mount of Transfiguration, they saw Jesus be exposed with all his glory, and he was standing there with Moses and Elijah. So Moses representing the law, Elijah representing the prophets. So he's representing all the prophets. It's argued that he is kind of the greatest of all the prophets. And we see this. We see reasons why. In 1 Kings 18, Elijah defeats 850 prophets of Baal and Asherah by preparing a sacrifice. So he prepares a sacrifice, he soaks it with water, and then he calls fire down from heaven to consume the sacrifice, proving that his God, the God of the Bible, is the only true and living God. And as a result, these prophets are disproven and they are defeated. And then right after that, he prays after 3 years of drought, and then rain comes. Right? You're thinking, this dude is on a streak, right? Like amazing victories. He's just dancing, like his faith is stronger than it's ever been. But then we get to 1 Kings 19, and we see how quickly that changes. In verse 1, Ahab, who's the king at the time, told Jezebel all that Elijah had done and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. Then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah. She shot him a text, right? commented on his post, "So may the gods do to me and more also if I do not make your life as the life of one of them this time tomorrow. I'm going to kill you," is what she said. And then you're thinking, this guy, unwavering faith, he's like going to be like, you know what? I'm going to call fire down from heaven on you. But no. Verse 3, then he was afraid and arose and ran for his life and came to Beersheba, which would be a great place for a brewery, I think. But also, it's the place, like you wouldn't have to come up with a clever name. It's just already there. But it's also the place where Elijah made an oath to God that he's going to follow him. This is a very significant place for Elijah. So we're going to kind of come back to that next week as well. So they came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and left his servant there. Not a great plan. But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a broom tree, and he asked that he might die, saying, "It is enough. Now, O Lord, take away my life, for I am no better than my fathers." So, from this story, I want to talk about 6 things that could have contributed to Elijah getting into the cave of depression. So, to define this really quickly, the cave of depression, I defined it a little bit, but this felt sense that I know there's a way out, but I just don't know where it is. It's disorienting, it's dark, it's lonely. I can kind of like feel some things, but I know things don't feel right? And you just feel like you're in a place that you can't get out. You're deep in this cave. And you know like there's bats somewhere, right? So you're just like kind of freaking out. Just kidding. So while I do recognize that counseling and medication can be the answer in some cases to help people overcome this, and this is needed, my advice for you from a trusted Christian counselor friend of mine is to exhaust all means to get free before you take that step to medication. Right? And I'm not saying that medication can be a grace that God uses to help set us free, but I want to talk about the ways make us more aware of how we get there. And then next week, I'm going to talk about how we get out. So I'm going to bring you all the way into the cave of depression today. You guys ready for that? Oh, great plan, right? You guys got to come back, though, to learn how to get out. All right, here we go. Number 1, life imbalances. Life imbalances. This is how we get in the cave. So Johann Hari, who wrote Lost Connection, said, we need to stop talking as much about chemical imbalances and more about the imbalances in the way that we live. More and more research is pointing to our lifestyle as the main factor that causes depression. It seems as though in this story that Elijah was running at a pace that was not sustainable. So when Jezebel commented on his Instagram post, it became more than he could bear. Something snapped, right? It's like, you ever had that feeling where just something snaps and in a moment it just turns? And previously you were like, great. And all of a sudden you're like, oh. And I think that can happen, right? When we walk at a pace that's unsustainable. And I think sometimes after our biggest victories, we're most susceptible to this because our guard is down. We've been on the offensive and gone through the battle, right? And then we forget that we have to rest and recharge and put those defenses back up. And so after we've exerted all of our energy, that's the point where we perhaps might be most susceptible to attack and to be taken down. And so for me, like Sunday afternoons are tough for me. Like my whole weeks leading up to this point right now, and I'm thinking about my message and all the things I should have said, and that thing I shouldn't have said, and that joke that nobody liked that, or that, whatever it is, right? I'm thinking about those things. And I can recognize this in myself. I'll have audible sighs. Like I'm not saying anything, but all of a sudden I'll just be like, and I'm like, it's just because I'm thinking about my message, or whatever I did or whatever I didn't do. And so when we jam-pack our schedule with too many good things, with the treadmill that keeps clicking up and up and up and never clicks down, we will eventually fall. So the point is, not everything that is doable is sustainable, right? Just because you can doesn't mean you should. And we did a whole series on hurry, and John Mark Comer wrote this book, and so I'm not sure if this is his definition or someone else's, but he describes what hurry sickness is. And it's a behavior pattern characterized by continual rushing and anxiousness, or a malaise, which is like a discomfort or an uneasiness, in which a person feels chronically short of time and so tends to perform every task faster and to get flustered when encountering any kind of delay. Don't mess with my schedule, right? I got to get to this thing next. I think to some degree we can all identify just in the American culture alone that we may have struggled to some degree with hurry sickness. Stephen Ilardi wrote The Depression Cure, said, "We were never designed for the sedentary, indoor, socially isolated, fast food-laden, sleep-deprived, frenzy pace of the modern life." And it's so true. Ecclesiastes 4:6 says this, "Better is a handful of quietness than 2 handfuls of toil and striving after the wind." So one handful of quietness or one handful with tranquility, as some translations use, is better than 2 handfuls that will overload you and cause you to fall. We have to find contentment. We have to know, as Pete Scazzero says, our God-given limits. We have to know our limits and live within those. Just a quick exercise that you could do at the beginning of this year, right? We're about to come into the Christmas season, the new year and all that stuff. At the beginning of this year, one of the things that Jefferson Bethke says, and he writes this book called To Hell with the Hustle, he says, every year, me and my family, we write down every single thing that we do, everything on our schedule, and we write it all down like individually on these little Post-it notes, and we put it out on our dining table. And it's all on our dining table is listed, everything that we do throughout the year. And then we walk around the table. First of all, we pick up all the things that are non-negotiables. Yes, we're definitely going to keep doing this, going to keep doing that, going to keep doing that. And then once you've got all the non-negotiables, you look at the table, right? And purpose to do everything, to continue doing everything that you're doing. And if things are left on the table, then you take them out of your schedule. And the point of the exercise is to do everything that you're doing on purpose, with purpose, to keep our life more in rhythm or more in balance. So life imbalances can get us in the cave. Number 2, comparing ourselves with others. Yeah. How do you not do that these days, right? It's just like, and Elijah did it. In verse 4, he says, "For I am no better than my fathers." He played the comparison game. And whether it's siblings or friends or neighbors or strangers on TV or otherwise, we're so incredibly tempted to do this, to look around and compare our lives with other people. And anti-social media, which I think is what it should be called from now on, is terrible about this. The creators of this stuff won't even let their kids use it. Like, the more we find out about it, the worse we're finding that it actually is. And like seriously, guys, you don't need to know what your acquaintance that you met one time in college had for dinner last night. Like, you don't need to know that. Like, we're just overloaded, right? And all right, don't put the quote up yet. I know I'm coming to the next, don't put it up yet. Any Teddy Roosevelt fans? Anybody in the audience? Yeah, some? Does anybody know what he said about comparison? There you go. Here we go. Quote, "Comparison is the thief of joy." The more you wonder what they have, why they have it, what they're doing, why they're doing it, the more it robs you of the joy that God wants to give you. 2 Corinthians 10:12, "Not that we dare classify or compare ourselves with some of those who are commending themselves, but when they measure themselves by one another and compare themselves with one another, they are without understanding." There is zero wisdom in us comparing ourselves to one another or comparing ourselves to people that we come in contact with. Whether it's stage of life or influence or talent or gifts or wealth or beauty or success, it's absolutely foolish for us to look at another person's portion and desire their portion to be ours, right? It's just not how God has made us. He's made us to be satisfied with what He's given us. And I would argue that perhaps pastors are some of the most susceptible to comparison. So I have to recognize I'm not Andy Stanley. I'm not Chris Hodges. I'm not Tim Keller. I'm not Terry Virgo, who's the founding leader of our family of churches, 2,500 churches around the world. I'm not even Carl Harrington, who's the founding leader of this church, right? I'm Bryce Fogel. And I'm fearfully and wonderfully made in the image of God, and God has set specific good works for me and no one else to walk in. And it's absolutely foolish for me to look at someone else's good works and say, I want to be in those good works. Listen, you are not smarter than God. I can promise you that. We have to stand and be satisfied in the portion and the life and the calling that He's given us. Number 3, the way we get into the cave, ruminating and self-talk. So we're going to read the specific scriptures next week, but there's a point where Elijah talks himself into believing a lie. He says that everyone else has forsaken God and I'm the only one left. I'm the only one. Right? And it's not true. We're going to find out it's not. It's just not. But he's talking himself into it. And we make these kind of extreme statements about ourselves in our mind through kind of an outburst of emotion. But what these things often are that we're saying over ourselves are curses. We're cursing ourselves by declaring, oh, I'm just not that good. Oh, I can't believe, it's just, we're doing it to ourselves. This idea, and it has the power to make us spiral, right? And if you've never heard this term ruminating, I'll describe it to you. It's so wonderful. And it's so appetizing as well. It's what a cow does when he chews the cud. So he literally eats grass, he chews on it, then he swallows it, and he digests it a little bit, and then he throws it back up, and he chews on it some more, then he swallows it again, digests it a little bit more, then he throws it back up, and he chews on it. That's what ruminating is. So how many people know that each time he throws it back up, it doesn't taste better, right? It tastes way worse. Like, trust me, I've never done it before, but it's the same thing that happens with our thoughts, guys. The more we ruminate those same thoughts over and over again, the more it causes us to spiral downwards and downwards. Brian Tracy said 95% of your emotions are determined by the way you talk to yourself. That's why we need to take every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. We have to ask, every thought that comes through our mind, is that biblical? Is that what God says about me? Is that what is true of me in Jesus? And choose to believe the truth and not the lies. We receive this, there's a sense where we have to receive God's grace daily. Right? And then follow the advice of Philippians 4. I read it last week, but I'll say it again. Finally, brothers, whatever is true, honorable, just, pure, lovely, commendable, anything with excellence, anything worthy of praise, think about these things. And what you have learned and received and heard and seen in me, practice these things. And this is how the God of peace will be with you. You don't have peace? Maybe it's because you're ruminating. You're chewing the cud of all the things that have happened, right? And Craig talked about earlier about how God wants us to bring us into this place of peace. This surpasses understanding. You want to know how you get there? Think about these things. Think about the things that God says about you. Number 4, the way we get into the cave, the inability to process pain in a healthy way. See, there seemed to be a deep pain in Elijah when he felt like his life was threatened by Jezebel. And by the way, I like joke about it, yeah, as an Instagram post or whatever, but like she had the power to make this happen. So there was like a real threat on his life. And he felt this sense of pain, and instead of taking the fear that he was feeling and confessing that to God and asking Him for help, or confessing that to those around him and asking them for help, he just freaked out, right? He ran away, he freaked out. And we all have different ways of coping with stress and pain and loss and anxiety when it comes our way. And we know, right, in our conscience when we're doing things that are leading us into a place of real rest where we can recoup, and when we're doing things that are just coping mechanisms, right? This is where kind of overindulgence gets confused with rest. And I'll say it this way, in 2020, drug addiction went up 18% in March, 29% in April, and 42% in June. It revealed the fact that people didn't have a healthy way of coping with this incredible amount of stress that was brought on all of us through the pandemic. And Viktor Frankl, who's a Jewish psychologist that helped people who were coping with the Holocaust, he proposed that the goal of our life is purpose. Unlike Freud, who said the goal of our life is pleasure. And so, you want to know what God used to get me out of the cave when I was feeling that sense of, I'm stuck in here and I don't know how to get out. My daughter's just been diagnosed. My world's been turned upside down. What do I do? God gave me a purpose. As I went to God for consolation, I talked to my friends and just talked about what had happened. God renewed kind of this lifelong, this purpose that he had given me. So our daughter, who was born and we adopted her, God helped me realize that whether or not we decided to adopt her, she would exist somewhere in this world. And she would have type 1 diabetes. And someone would need to care for her. And he helped me realize the gift of the fact that we get the privilege, we get the honor of caring for this little girl who needs it. And it just flipped the whole thing on its head to the point where it was like, God, you chose me to do this. You've given me this, and it's a heavy task, but it's an amazing task to care for this little girl, to help her process the pain of her own adoption, process the pain of being diagnosed with type 1. And she has the opportunity, if she chooses to follow Jesus and give her life to the purposes of God, to be an incredible help to other people who might be going through similar things. And that's what God does. He takes our pain, he flips it on its head, and then he causes us to be able to use it to comfort others. In 2 Corinthians 1:4, he who comforts us in our affliction so that we may be able to comfort those who are in any affliction with the comfort that we ourselves receive from God. That's part of the purpose that God wants to put in every one of us. And in this instance, God brought me out of the cave by giving me kind of a new purpose. Instead of me just sulking, he gave me a new purpose and a challenge to step into in faith, even though it was a place where I was uncomfortable. But he was drawing me into that place. And that's why we want you to discover your purpose so that you can make a difference. That's part of what the growth track is all about, is like initiating that journey to discover how you're wired and what your gifts are. To be able to step into a real God-given purpose so that you can make a difference. Not only here by kind of serving on a serving team, but also throughout the rest of your week. Right, at your job or whatever it is, you can utilize the things and the reasons why God has put you on this earth to find the vision for the life that God has called you to live. Right, you can do that. When we lose sight of that, when we're not processing our pain properly, we can find ourselves in the cave. Number 5, isolation and loneliness. Way into the cave. Elijah left his servant at Beersheba. He's chilling at the brewery, I guess. And then went on a day's journey in the wilderness. So, have you ever noticed that sin was not the first problem in the Bible, that loneliness was? So Genesis 2:18, then God said, after saying everything is good, he said, it is not good that man should be alone. I will make a helper fit for him. And I touched on it last week, but this is one of the biggest problems facing society today, right? There's now a loneliness minister in places like the UK and Japan. According to a Gallup poll, when asked, did you experience loneliness a lot of the day yesterday? And that's just one day, talking about the day before, 17% said yes, and the number was found to be significantly higher in single adults. At the height of the pandemic, 41% of single adults said yes to this question. Did you experience loneliness a lot of the day yesterday? 58% would say that no one really knows them well. That means a good portion of this room, and if you're watching from home. George Gallup said Americans are among the loneliest people in the world. One study showed loneliness to be the equivalent of smoking 15 cigarettes per day, has a greater impact on your lifespan than obesity, and is linked to heart disease. Guys, we were not meant to go through this life alone. And if you're struggling with depression, you aren't meant to go through that alone. We need each other for the abundant life that Jesus promised. And that's why we say that you find freedom in our small groups. That's why we have smaller. This is great to come here on Sunday, worship together, but we need to know each other and be known by one another. And that's what happens within the context of our groups, where we can pray for each other and know how we're struggling and how to pray. It's this idea that it's not about me, it's about we. And so I just want to encourage you, we're going to have a meeting on the back end of this series 2 Sundays from now at 7 p.m. right here at the Jubilee Center, November 5th. If you've struggled with any kind of mental illness, you've had it in your past, you're in the middle of it right now, or maybe you feel like you're on the way into that place, I just want to invite you to come. It's going to be a smaller meeting. It'll be me and one of the elders, Simon, who was up here earlier, will be there, as well as another couple who have experienced some of these things in their past. And so a guy and a gal. So I just want to invite you, if you're struggling in any way, you want to indicate on your communication card that you want to be a part of that, I'd love to invite you to that. And the idea isn't to be like counseled, but the idea is just to come and to share your story and to hear other people share their story. And to find someone else who's perhaps on a similar journey as you and to say after that meeting, hey, let's get some coffee together and let's talk a little bit more. But I don't want this to be stigmatized in this church, and I don't want people who come in and are struggling this way to feel like they have to do it alone, because you don't. There are other people that can help. And so we just want to make a way for that to happen. Again, November 5th, 7 p.m., it'll happen right here at the Jubilee Center. Let's go ahead and have the band come up. Number 6. The way that we get into the cave. Spiritual warfare. Now, I'm not a doctor. I'm not a psychiatrist, a therapist, or a counselor, but I am a pastor. And I can tell you by experience, this is probably one of the most overlooked and underestimated reasons why somebody ends up in the cave. What if I told you that a very bad person had a key to your house? And you don't know it, but tonight is the night, and they're planning to come and take everything that you care about. They're going to bind up your kids and take them away. They're going to take everything in your house. What would you do to keep that from happening? What would you do? Well, I tell you what I'd do. I'd call the police, first of all. I'd call all my friends who own guns. I'd arm myself. And my house would be like Fort Knox, right? You wouldn't be able to cross the barrier. And then the police would be like, hey man, probably don't do that because we got this. But that would be my natural instinct. 1 Peter 5, 6 through 9. Humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, that at the proper time he may exalt you. Casting all your anxieties on him. This doesn't happen by osmosis. You have to actually cast your anxieties on God so that he can care for you. It's because he cares for you. And this is the key verse, verse 8. Be sober-minded. Be watchful. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. Resist him, firm in your faith. Guys, this isn't just like imagery. This is real. There is the devil, Satan, exists, and he wants nothing more but to destroy you and to bring you and draw you and keep you in the cave and to convince you that there's no way out. Ephesians 6, finally be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might. Put on the whole armor of God. The armor of God's there. You got to put it on. You got to put on the armor of God so that you may be able to stand against the schemes of the devil. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, authorities, cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. That's what we're up against. And in the same way that we can't make the mistake of over-spiritualizing depression, we also can't make the mistake of under-spiritualizing. The devil is doing everything in his power to bring us down. We have to call on God, right? So to bring the analogy full circle, call on God, maybe the police, right? We call God. We ask God for help. We call our friends because we need one another. And then we arm ourselves because we realize that we're in a battle. And we recognize, and the whole point of this message is for us to help you recognize the schemes of the devil. And these are all ways that he wants to drag you into that cave. And so I want us to be aware of those, to be equipped so that we won't be drawn into that place. Let's go ahead and stand. So again, these are 6 ways that can lead us into the cave of depression. And I want to invite you to come back next week and hear about 5 ways that you can get out. And we're going to talk specifically about that. And I just want to invite you as well, like we have this meeting, November 5th, 7 p.m. right here at the Jubilee Center. If you feel alone in this process of exploring your struggle with mental health, I just want to invite you to come here to the Jubilee Center and to meet other people who might be going on a similar journey and not feel alone in that journey. We're going to sing a song together just as a response, and then I'll come up and close this in prayer. Let's sing together.